Zola Mehta, a bright and spirited 24-year-old from Johannesburg, South Africa, had moved to the United States to pursue her dream of studying international relations. In 2017, she had been in the country for nearly a year, settling into her new life with ease. Her vibrant personality made her a beloved figure in her community. As a South African immigrant, Zola embodied the aspirations of many young women like her to make a mark on the world while bridging cultures and creating meaningful change. On the night of June 14, 2017, Zola and her close friend, Sarah Walsh, planned a girls' night out. Sarah, a fellow student at the same university, had bonded with Zola over their shared passion for global politics. The two had become inseparable, and this night was supposed to be a celebration of the end of the school year. They spent the evening at a popular downtown bar in the bustling city of Minneapolis, surrounded by laughter, music, and friends. The night, full of promise and joy, took a dark turn that no one could have anticipated. Around 1 a.m., the two friends decided to leave the bar. Their Uber ride was supposed to be a short and safe trip back to their dorm, but Zola and Sarah never made it home. Minutes after they stepped outside, they were approached by two men in a dark sedan. What started as an attempt to simply rob them escalated into a horrifying abduction. Zola and Sarah were forced into the car at gunpoint, their carefree night transforming into an unthinkable nightmare. The once familiar streets of Minneapolis became unfamiliar and dangerous. The events that followed were pieced together through police reports and the testimony of witnesses, but the details were fragmented. The men, later identified as Tyrone Banks and Matthew Parker, were part of a local gang involved in petty thefts and violent crimes. Their original intent was robbery, but as they drove through the empty streets, the situation spiraled out of control. Zola and Sarah's lives were no longer in their own hands. For the next several hours, they were driven around the city, enduring unspeakable terror. The car continued to drive aimlessly through the night. The men, both intoxicated and agitated, had no clear plan. Zola and Sarah were confined to the back seat, their hands bound as they pleaded for their lives. The situation grew more desperate by the minute. Zola, known for her resilience, tried to remain calm. She had faced hardships before in her journey from South Africa to the U.S., but nothing could have prepared her for this. After hours of driving, the car eventually stopped in a remote, wooded area on the outskirts of the city. It was now close to dawn, but the sky was still dark, adding an eerie atmosphere to the already grim situation. The men ordered Zola and Sarah out of the car. It was clear that the robbery had long since escalated into something far more sinister. Tyrone and Matthew searched through Zola and Sarah's bags, taking what little cash and personal items they could find. The criminals, feeling cornered, made a snap decision to leave no witnesses. But what happened next is known only through the scattered accounts of investigators. Zola, despite her desperate situation, put up a fight. The tension in the air erupted into chaos. Sarah tried to escape but was struck violently across the head by Tyrone. She lost consciousness. When she woke up hours later, it was daylight and she was lying in the brush, severely injured but alive. Zola was nowhere to be seen. Panicked, Sarah struggled to get up and stumbled through the woods until she found a passing car. The driver, a kind-hearted stranger, immediately called 911. As paramedics rushed to the scene, Sarah was barely able to recall the events of the night. Her fractured memory was the only lead the police had in finding Zola. For hours, a search ensued in the dense forested area where Sarah had been found, but Zola's body was eventually discovered a few miles away. She had been brutally beaten and left for dead. The news of Zola's murder sent shockwaves through her community. Friends, family, and classmates were devastated. Zola had been an intelligent, compassionate young woman with dreams of changing the world, only for her life to be stolen in such a violent, senseless act. Sarah, though surviving the physical attack, would be forever haunted by the trauma of that night. The vibrant joy of two close friends had been shattered by unimaginable violence. In Minneapolis, a city already wrestling with crime found itself grappling with another tragedy. The police investigation swiftly moved into action. Evidence collected at the scene pointed to Tyrone Banks and Matthew Parker, who had already been on the radar of local law enforcement for their involvement in multiple criminal activities. Their car, abandoned a few miles from where Zola's body had been found, was a key piece of evidence that led to their eventual capture. However, as the legal proceedings began, a new layer of complexity emerged. though they were charged with robbery, kidnapping, and assault, both men vehemently denied the murder of Zola Mata. The courtroom would soon become the battleground for a trial that would test the limits of justice. For Zola's family, the fight had only just begun. In the days following the discovery of Zola Mata's body, Minneapolis police launched an exhaustive investigation to piece together what had happened that tragic night. Tyrone Banks and Matthew Parker had been apprehended within 48 hours of the crime, thanks to swift work by detectives and tips from local informants who had recognized their vehicle. The media quickly latched onto the story, casting a spotlight on the brutal murder of a young South African woman who had come to the U.S. in pursuit of her dreams. The detectives assigned to the case, led by Detective Lauren Fisher, were seasoned professionals, but this case carried an emotional weight that affected everyone involved. The brutality of Zola's death, combined with the sheer randomness of the crime, shook even the most hardened members of law enforcement. The goal was clear: build an airtight case to ensure Tyrone Banks and Matthew Parker were held accountable not just for the robbery and kidnapping, but for Zola's murder as well. The investigation started with Sarah Walsh's testimony. Although her memories were fragmented from the trauma and head injury, she was able to provide key details about the men who had abducted them. Sarah's recounting of the night painted a horrifying picture of the ordeal, but the gaps in her recollection made it difficult to establish the exact sequence of events leading to Zola's death. Despite this, her testimony was enough to place Tyrone and Matthew at the scene of the crime. Forensic evidence began to pile up. The car used in the abduction contained fingerprints that matched both Tyrone and Matthew. Bloodstains inside the vehicle were confirmed to be Zola's, and further analysis revealed the presence of her DNA on both men's clothing. It was a strong foundation for the prosecution, but there was a missing piece. No weapon or direct cause of death had yet been identified. The autopsy results were grim. Zola had suffered blunt force trauma to the head, consistent with a vicious beating, but there were also signs of strangulation. The medical examiner concluded that Zola had likely died from a combination of both injuries, leaving no clear indication of whether a single attacker had caused her death or if both men had been involved. This ambiguity presented a potential hurdle for the prosecution, as the defense would undoubtedly exploit the lack of concrete evidence pinning the murder on either Tyrone or Matthew. Despite their overwhelming guilt in the kidnapping and robbery, both men maintained their innocence regarding the murder. Their defense attorney argued that the abduction had spiraled out of control, but insisted that neither man had intended to kill Zola. The men pointed fingers at one another, each claiming the other had been responsible for the violence. As the investigation progressed, it became clear that the trial would be a complex and emotionally charged affair. The case was not just about securing justice for Zola's family, but also about holding the perpetrators accountable for the life they had brutally ended. The trial of Tyrone Banks and Matthew Parker began in late 2018, over a year after Zola's murder. The courtroom was packed with reporters, family members, and members of the public eager for justice. Zola's family had flown in from South Africa to attend the proceedings, and their grief was palpable. Zola's parents, Thandi and Sipho Mata, had been outspoken advocates for their daughter since her death, ensuring her story remained in the public eye. They had founded the Zola Mata Foundation in her memory, dedicated to helping victims of violence and supporting educational opportunities for young women, a cause close to Zola's heart. Prosecution, led by District Attorney Sarah Mills, presented a strong case. The evidence was compelling. Surveillance footage from the bar showed Tyrone and Matthew loitering in the area before approaching Zola and Sarah, confirming that they had been stalking the two women for some time. The timeline matched perfectly with the accounts provided by Sarah, and the forensic evidence linked the men to the crime. The prosecutors emphasized the brutality of the attack, painting a vivid picture of Zola's final moments and the terror she must have experienced. Sarah Walsh's testimony was the emotional centerpiece of the prosecution's case. Although she struggled to recall certain details, her account of the kidnapping, her injuries, and the horrifying discovery of Zola's body left a profound impact on the courtroom. Her bravery in recounting the events of that night earned her widespread sympathy. Still, the defense sought to undermine her credibility, pointing out the gaps in her memory due to the trauma and head injury. The defense claimed that the confusion about the night's events created reasonable doubt as to who was responsible for Zola's death. The defense's strategy was to sow doubt about the murder charge. They admitted that Tyrone and Matthew had committed the robbery and kidnapping, but argued that Zola's death had not been a premeditated act. Their argument hinged on the idea that the violence had erupted spontaneously, a tragic result of panic rather than intent. Each defendant tried to paint the other as the instigator of the violence, distancing themselves from the murder. Tyrone's lawyer pointed out that his client had no prior history of violent crime, while Matthew's legal team suggested that Tyrone had been the one to deliver the fatal blows in a fit of rage. The prosecution countered these arguments by presenting the overwhelming forensic evidence that tied both men to the scene. Although there was no clear indication of who had struck the fatal blow, the fact that both men had participated in the kidnapping and assault was undeniable. District Attorney Sarah Mills hammered home the idea that both men were equally culpable regardless of who had committed the final act of violence. As the trial stretched on, the emotional toll on everyone involved became evident. Zola's family remained stoic throughout, attending each day of the proceedings. Their presence was a constant reminder of the life that had been cut short of the daughter whose future had been stolen. But despite the prosecution's strong case, the question of whether justice would be fully served lingered heavily in the air. The defense continued to play on the ambiguity of the evidence, hoping to secure a lesser conviction for their clients. The outcome of the trial would hinge not just on the facts but on the jury's interpretation of the events of that night. In a case this emotional and complex, there were no guarantees. As the trial entered its third week, tensions mounted in the courtroom. The prosecution had built a compelling case, but the defense's persistent efforts to cloud the narrative with doubt began to take its toll. The weight of uncertainty hung over every witness testimony, every piece of evidence. Zola Mambata's family watched each day unfold with the quiet, dignified resolve they had maintained since the beginning, but their pain was undeniable. For them, there was no ambiguity. Their daughter had been taken from them, her future stolen in the most horrific way imaginable. Public interest in the case remained high. Local and national news outlets covered every development, and as the trial progressed, opinion among the public began to fracture. Some believed the overwhelming evidence of guilt was enough to convict both men of murder, while others questioned whether the prosecution could definitively prove that Tyrone Banks and Matthew Parker had intended to kill Zola. The men's defense teams continued to argue that the murder was an unintended consequence of the robbery, a spontaneous act rather than a calculated one. The most damning piece of evidence presented by the prosecution came in the form of a cell phone recording found on Matthew Parker's phone. The video, filmed during the car ride after the abduction, captured a brief and chilling moment. Zola and Sarah bound and pleading for their lives in the backseat, while Tyrone and Matthew laughed, clearly intoxicated and reveling in their power over the two women. Although the recording cut off before any violence occurred, it painted a disturbing picture of the men's state of mind and their disregard for human life. The jury watched the video in complete silence, the gravity of the evidence sinking in. It was clear from the audio that Zola had tried to reason with her captors, pleading for their release and offering whatever they had in exchange for their safety. The laughter in response was cold and indifferent, and it undercut the defense's argument that the crime had spiraled out of control unexpectedly. Yet still, the crucial question remained unanswered: who had delivered the fatal blow? For the defense, this video was a setback, but they persisted. Tyrone Banks' attorney Richard Gaines seized on the opportunity to emphasize his client's supposed lack of physical involvement in Zola's murder. He argued that the recording showed Tyrone was merely a bystander to Matthew's escalating aggression. While they both may have been guilty of abduction, Gaines insisted, Tyrone had not laid a hand on Zola or Sarah during the final moments of their captivity. Matthew Parker's lawyer, on the other hand, tried to flip the narrative, suggesting that Tyrone had initiated the violence when things got out of hand. The courtroom became a battlefield of accusations, each man attempting to throw the other under the bus. The trial dragged on, but the question of culpability was as murky as ever. For Zola's family, this back and forth was a nightmare, so they were forced to relive their daughter's final hours through the lens of legal strategies designed to minimize responsibility. It was excruciating, and the stress began to show on their faces. As the trial neared its conclusion, the weight of the decision facing the jury became apparent. The prosecution had provided overwhelming evidence of the men's involvement in the kidnapping and assault, but the lack of direct proof of who had killed Zola left room for doubt. The jury had to decide whether the evidence of joint participation in the crime was enough to hold both men fully accountable for her murder, or if the defense's arguments about the lack of premeditation would sway them toward a lesser conviction. The defense rested their case, and both sides delivered their closing arguments. The prosecution's final words were a plea for justice, a reminder of Zola's stolen future, and a condemnation of the men who had taken it from her. The defense, in contrast, appealed to the uncertainty of the facts, asking the jury to consider the possibility that neither man had intended to commit murder that night. It was a final gambit in a trial that had seen emotional highs and devastating lows. After weeks of testimony, evidence, and legal maneuvers, the fate of Tyrone Banks and Matthew Parker was placed in the hands of the jury. They were tasked with determining the degree of each man's guilt, a decision that would ultimately shape the future of Zola Mbatha's case and the pursuit of justice for her family. The jury's deliberation stretched over several days, during which the courtroom remained in a tense state of limbo. The media continued to cover the proceedings with breathless anticipation, speculating on the possible outcomes. Would the jury convict both men of murder, or would they find that the evidence didn't meet the standard for a first-degree conviction? The uncertainty was agonizing, particularly for Zola's family, who had waited so long for some semblance of closure. Meanwhile, Sarah Walsh struggled to remain composed as she sat through the trial. The trauma of that night had left scars both visible and invisible, and she knew that whatever the outcome, her life would never be the same. On the fourth day of deliberation, the jury finally reached a decision. The courtroom was packed as the foreman stood to deliver the verdict. It was a moment charged with emotion, the culmination of more than a year of grief, frustration, and unanswered questions. As the judge asked the jury for their findings, the air seemed to stand still. Tyrone Banks and Matthew Parker were found guilty of multiple charges, including kidnapping, armed robbery, and aggravated assault. But when it came to the charge of first-degree murder, the jury was divided. After hours of debate, they had concluded that while both men were responsible for the events leading up to Zola's death, the evidence was insufficient to convict them of premeditated murder. Instead, they were found guilty of second-degree murder, acknowledging that while Zola's death had been the result of their actions, it was not a planned or deliberate killing. The verdict hit Zola's family hard. While the men would face lengthy prison sentences for their crimes, the lesser conviction felt like a compromise, a painful reminder that justice was not always black and white. Second-degree murder carried a severe penalty, but it did not carry the same weight as a conviction for first-degree murder. To Zola's parents, it felt like the system had failed their daughter in some way, as though her life had not been fully valued in the eyes of the law. Tyrone and Matthew were both sentenced to 40 years in prison, a fate that would likely keep them behind bars for the rest of their lives. But for the Mbatha family, no sentence could undo the horror of what had been taken from them. As the trial came to an end, they were left with the heavy burden of trying to move forward without Zola, knowing that true justice had slipped just out of reach. The courtroom fell into a heavy silence as the verdict was read, the words echoing through the minds of all present. Zola Mbatha's family, stoic throughout the trial, showed visible signs of pain as the reality of the verdict sank in. Guilty of second-degree murder, Tyrone Banks and Matthew Parker would spend decades in prison, but to Zola's parents, Tandy and Sipho Mbatha, it felt like a hollow victory. They had fought for over a year for justice, but this outcome left them feeling as though their daughter's life had been diminished, her death reduced to an unintentional tragedy in the eyes of the law. The media spun the verdict in a variety of ways. Some outlets praised the justice system for securing a conviction, emphasizing that the two men would be held accountable for their heinous actions. Others, however, echoed the sentiments of Zola's family, pointing out the complexities of the case and questioning whether the punishment fit the crime. The city of Minneapolis, already reeling from a rising wave of violent crime, became even more divided in its opinions on the justice system. Public discussions about race, immigration, and systemic inequality began to dominate the headlines, with Zola's tragic death at the center. For Tandy and Sipho, there was no time to dwell on public opinion. Their grief was a private matter, but their quest for justice continued. In the weeks following the verdict, they began speaking openly about their frustrations with the trial's outcome. Their goal was not revenge, but a deeper reckoning with the failures of the system that had let their daughter's killers escape the full weight of justice. Zola's mother, Tandy in particular, became a vocal advocate, speaking at public forums and participating in interviews to raise awareness about the challenges faced by families seeking justice for loved ones lost to violent crime. The Mattis efforts led to the creation of the Zola Matha Foundation, a charitable organization dedicated to supporting victims of violent crime, especially immigrants and people of color. The foundation aimed to provide legal assistance, counseling, and financial aid to families who, like theirs, found themselves caught in the complexities of the American legal system. It also focused on promoting educational opportunities for young women, a cause close to Zola's heart. Through their foundation, the Mathis found a way to channel their grief into something meaningful, a way to ensure that Zola's legacy would live on. But their fight wasn't over. They filed an appeal, hoping to push for a harsher sentence for Tyrone and Matthew. The appeal would be a long and arduous process, but Pandy and Sifa were determined to pursue it, believing that their daughter's life deserved nothing less. Meanwhile, Sarah Walsh struggled with her own journey of healing. The physical wounds from that night had healed, but the psychological scars ran deep. She had been thrust into the spotlight as a key witness during the trial, and now that it was over, she felt adrift. The trauma had fractured her ability to move on, and she found it difficult to return to the normal life she had once known. Therapy helped, but Sarah knew she would carry the burden of that night with her forever. Like the Matha family, she found solace in working with the foundation, using her experience to advocate for victims of violent crime. The aftermath of the trial left Minneapolis with an uneasy sense of unfinished business. The high-profile nature of the case had drawn significant attention to issues of crime, race, and justice in the city, and as the public grappled with the outcome, protests and rallies emerged. Some community members called for harsher sentences for violent offenders, while others focused on the systemic failures that had allowed a night of terror like Zola's to happen in the first place. The division was stark, reflecting a city in turmoil. Zola's story resonated particularly with the immigrant community in Minneapolis. For many, her death symbolized the vulnerability of those who came to the U.S. in search of better opportunities, only to find themselves confronted by violence and discrimination. Thandi Matha's impassioned speeches about her daughter's struggle and untimely death became a rallying cry for those who felt marginalized by a system that often seemed indifferent to their plight. The Zola Matha Foundation began to grow in influence, attracting donations and support from people across the country who were moved by the Matha family's resilience. At the same time, the legal system came under fire for its handling of the case. Critics argued that the complexity of the evidence, especially the uncertainty around which man had delivered the fatal blow, had allowed the defense to manipulate the narrative. Others pointed out that the legal system was often more lenient on criminals when the victims were women of color, a disturbing pattern that left many feeling disillusioned. The prosecutors, while praised for their efforts, were also scrutinized for not pursuing a more aggressive strategy from the outset. As the appeal process began, the legal community watched closely, knowing that the outcome could set a precedent for future cases involving joint culpability in violent crimes. If successful, the appeal could lead to a retrial or a harsher sentence for Tyrone and Matthew. But the road ahead was long, and the emotional strain on the Matha family was profound. Despite their determination, the constant revisiting of Zola's death in legal proceedings kept their grief raw and unrelenting. Zola's friends, too, struggled with the aftermath. Many of them had shared dreams of international diplomacy, human rights work, and activism. They had come to the U.S. with the hope of building bridges between cultures, but Zola's murder shattered that idealism. Several of her closest friends returned to South Africa after the trial, unable to reconcile the image of their vibrant friend with the violent country that had taken her life. Those who stayed behind found themselves more committed than ever to the causes Zola had championed, vowing to carry on her legacy of empathy and social justice. As time passed, Zola's name became a symbol for more than just her personal tragedy. She represented the broader struggle for immigrant rights, the fight against gender-based violence, and the quest for justice in an imperfect system. In her memory, those who loved her continued to fight, not just for her, but for the countless others whose lives had been cut short by violence and whose stories might otherwise be forgotten. Minneapolis, too, was changed by the trial. The case became a turning point for local discussions about policing, community safety, and the role of the justice system in protecting vulnerable populations. In the wake of the verdict, reforms were proposed to better support victims of violent crime, including more resources for counseling and legal aid. The city had been shaken by Zola's death, but from that pain emerged a renewed commitment to addressing the root causes of violence and inequality. Months after the trial concluded, the appeal that Zola Matha's family had hoped for was denied. The original sentence stood 40 years in prison for Tyrone Banks and Matthew Parker. It was a bitter pill for Thandi and Sifo Matha to swallow, but they had grown to accept that no legal ruling could ever truly bring back their daughter or fill the void left by her death. Their fight for justice had been long and grueling, but it was not the end of Zola's story.